Hey everyone, Vegan Mark here. Following my previous video, I've actually worked on my philosophy of life, as I call it, and I'm going to talk it through with you now, despite how complex it actually is. So I've called it Tenets of my Nihilist philosophy. It's nihilist because it seems to attribute no value to a situation where I'm in incalculable suffering and there is virtually nothing I can do about it. But this situation is very similar to the situation of commodified and exploited animals in the farming practices of humankind, for example. And I'm going to figure out what makes my predicament as a human who has some capacity to change my situation different from that of most farmed animals, and whether I should actually do something about my situation or the state of things more generally. So this is the first tenet of my nihilist philosophy. Being preoccupied with something to do and the pursuit of justice and philosophy are all distractive privileges to those, especially humans, who might otherwise be living in absolute sufferance. So this is a very complicated concept, of course, but basically it means that because I have the capacity to do something, to distract myself, to work, to go and work, to study law, to teach students each ESL, to do all of these things, I am somewhat privileged as a human, whereas someone living through a Holocaust in a prison camp or completely neglected and completely tortured does not have the same privileges as I do. So I do have privileges, whereas some people do not have privileges. As a long-term sufferer, the inclination to absolutise that suffering is an impossible locus of all my thoughts and actions. So, because people are suffering more than me, I have a kind of temptation to try and suffer even more, just to claim the status of being the one who suffers the most. But the honest truth of that is that I'm not the greatest sufferer in the world, even though my suffering is absolute and it's obviously undeniable that I'm suffering a lot. I am not suffering more than the trillions of sentient animals who are slaughtered for human consumption, for example. I'm not suffering as much as a lot of the wild animals who are hunted and preyed upon by other animals in the wild, for example. It's literally impossible to absolutize suffering, because a hierarchy of suffering will always exist, just as there will always be beings who are suffering more and less than oneself. So as I mentioned, I'm not suffering intensely. I'm suffering quite a lot, but I'm not suffering intensely enough to justify suffering even more, for example, or the idea of committing suicide, for example, may overcome a lot of my suffering. But let's have a think about the other issues before we talk about suicide. Tenet number 2, justice is fragile and extremely elusive. So justice is a construct of human society. It's not a product of nature, and as we know, nature in itself is very inhospitable and very unjust a lot of the time. Justice can never be fully achieved unless we could go back in time, and by that I mean injustice in history has already existed for countless thousands and thousands and millions of years probably. But it is possible to work into a state of ongoing justice and comfortability for all sentient life, otherwise known as a vegan world. So it is possible for humans who have power over their dominion to create or fabricate a life of complete, or a society of complete justice and comfortability for all sentient life. We will eventually have that power, but at the moment it's all very airy-fairy. There are social constructs such as law and medicine and, science and all sorts of other areas of knowledge which allow us to have a sense of justice but do not achieve justice entirely. Once we achieve a vegan world, that justice will be absolute, but that will not come until thousands of years later. Number 3, justice is often, even usually, but not always, caused by persons who are not intent on causing harm. This is a very important observation. I noticed that there are some good people in the mental health authority that I am an involuntary client of. So in other words, there are some good people who do bad things. There are some people who are good people who work in very evil occupations and who are forced to do evil things as a result of their job, for example. Nature is naturally disposed to injustice, and living in a society where justice is even remotely objectified is a privilege in itself. So, nature is naturally unjust, and living in a society where justice is even remotely objectified is a privilege in itself. So things like law, medicine, all these things which are designed to help humans particularly, are a privilege to humans. Whereas, other creatures like most animals, for example, do not have access to justice like humans. Most humans might. Tenet number 4. In such a complex paradigm, the only thing that one can be assured of doing correctly is not even the reduction or euphemization of one's own suffering, but working on the reduction of suffering overall for future generations. So despite the irony, working on a book that will be published in the future is still a noble and worthwhile objective. So basically, tenet number 4 says that, okay, there are so many uncertainties in the tenets, the first 3 tenets that I mentioned, that the only thing that we can do with any amount of certainty is to try and improve our situation, no matter what the other objectives are and the other beliefs are. The only thing that we can do is to try and improve our situation and to improve the situation generally of suffering in this world. So I talked about, writing a book and being famous and being published and so on. I still think, after reflection in this video, that that's actually a worthwhile objective. And I didn't conclude that in my previous video, but actually, now that I think about it, with all the uncertainties and ironies of nihilism and the nihilist philosophy that I've just developed, working on a book and trying to develop and resolve my life, despite all the uncertainties that exist, may well be a legacy that is worth being proud of and worth achieving in eventually. And it's going to be a very, very slow process. And as I mentioned, there is so much injustice in this world that you just can't poke a stick at it. You just have to dig away at it and try your best to eradicate as much injustice as possible, because there's so much that exists. And I think there are a lot of humans and people in the society who are very cocky that they live in a just and fair world, but that's absolutely not true, and I'm testament to that. My life of suffering is testament to that. But I will continue to try and improve on the suffering that I have and the suffering in the world today. So that's why I'm a vegan anti-natalist. That's why I will continue to post these videos. And I thank you very much for your time and your attention today. Thank you very much. Bye for now.